All right. Well, welcome here to Questioning Christianity. My name's Dan Patterson, and this channel is all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. My guest today for this live stream is Erik Manning, who you may know better as the host of Testify, the YouTube channel. He's been making some brilliant videos for years, mostly with some fun animations, which you probably see come up in your shorts. But we wanted to do an episode today exploring what are some of the objections that people have when it comes to the Gospels. Can we trust that these are reliable eyewitness accounts from the first century doing historical reportage on the life and words and events of Jesus's life? And so hopefully this is going to be useful. We'll use a bunch of viral TikTok videos as sort of the foil to bring up many of these different objections. But Erik, it may be great for those who haven't come across your channel before, which we'll definitely link down in the description. Tell us a bit about your own story and how you got into really wrestling with a lot of the positive case for the reliability of the Gospels and many of the objections then that you field in response.
Sure. I got into apologetics mostly just because there was a time in my life where I've never really had doubts. I know sometimes people get into apologetics just because of wrestling with their own doubts. It was just sharing the gospel with others and then coming at me with objections that, like, I didn't really know how to give like a fully articulate response to some of the objections that I was getting. And so I started just looking into it, but there is just such a sea of information with Christian apologetics and just all the different ways people say that it should be done, this, that, and the other, that I was just simply overwhelmed. And I remember like posting like a message or something on Facebook, and a guy by the name of Tim McGrew, who is a awesome Christian philosopher, teaches at the University of Western Michigan. He just kind of reached out to me and kind of sort of took me and a few other people who expressed the same frustration under his wing and just gave me a bunch of really awesome books on like historical apologetics, which fit me to a T because I wasn't like a very good student. Like even back in high school, I kind of had a shady past. We won't have to get into that, but the one class that I could always pay attention to in ACE without even really studying was history. I've just always been
That's
drawn to
cool.
history. I like history. It's just something that I can easily remember, a lot of the stuff. And so I was like, yeah, that's awesome. So he loaded me up with a ton of books. And then I've just kind of been friends with the McGrews ever since. And they were able to kind of help me answer my questions and give me materials and all that other kind of stuff. And I just think a lot like them in terms of like evidentialism and different things like that. So that's how I got interested in the Gospels and defending the reliability of the Gospels. And then I started with a blog, and then it eventually became a YouTube channel. And then here we are today. So.
Well, make sure you do go check out Testify and subscribe and watch some of the videos there. They're enormously helpful. And I just love the way as well, the kind of the storytelling of the graphics really does help kind of just process the reactions and emotions and stuff. So you do a great job with that. Tim and Lydia have both been on the channel here before as well. Tim did an Easter episode with us a couple of years ago. It's a great one to pull out at this time of year as we lead up towards the events of Easter. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, I'd like to learn more about him, you can go and check that out. And we did one with Lydia McGrew on the sort of historical reliability of John's Gospel, particularly, which is often the one that's called most into question as the latest of the four that are written. But if you're just joining this live stream, let me lay out a couple of things, maybe by way of background before I jump in and ask Erik some questions. You may be wondering, why does it matter whether we can trust the four Gospels in the New Testament? And this is really diving at the heart of what we know about Jesus of Nazareth. Paul, the apostle, gives us through his letters of the New Testament a bunch of historical facts about Jesus, about 15 or 20 in all, kind of a skeleton of the life of Jesus. But if you want to get flesh on that skeleton, that's where we come to these four biographies: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's a question of whether we know what Jesus's teachings are, whether we know what Jesus claimed about himself, whether we know how he understood himself in relation to Israel's story and Israel's scriptures. It's whether or not he claimed to be divine and made human, whether or not he claimed that his death would be an atoning sacrifice for sins, whether or not he rose again from the dead credibly, and the stories and eyewitnesses that were to that. All of that hinges on the four Gospels that we have in the New Testament. So they carry enormous significance, certainly for Christianity as a whole, but for you in terms of trying to wrestle with whether Jesus has answers to life's deepest questions. And we have a positive case for the reliability of the Gospels that I did with a live stream with Wes Huff and with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy about a year ago now, where we lay out about a dozen or so arguments for the credibility of these Gospels. But today we wanted to say, but what about And all of those skeptical videos that fly around TikTok, all of those reasonable questions that you may have, how can I take this seriously when? And we want to dive into many of those today. So Erik, welcome to anyone who's joining as well. Some people maybe from Erik's kind of crowd that follow Testify. It's great to have you on. If anyone wants to ask any questions for us to be able to go through as well, you can just chuck them right in the live chat. Put a little cue at the beginning so we know where they are, and we may bring them up as we're going. But I wanted to kick off, Erik, if we can, with probably just an important one. And this has to do with the dating of the Gospels. Where exactly were the Gospels written? Because you'll often hear people still making the argument that they're roughly a century or 100 years after the life of Jesus. Critical scholars would probably date it a little bit earlier than that, somewhere between 70 and 90 or 100 AD for the four Gospels. But let me maybe just share this with Bart Ehrman, speaking here about the dating of the stories around Joseph of Arimathea as a whole. So we'll play this and then I'll get your response.
Okay.
Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus, the first time it's mentioned is 40 years after the fact by an author who not only was not there, he is living in a different part of the world. He's speaking a different language. He doesn't know any eyewitnesses. He doesn't say anything about any eyewitnesses. He doesn't name any eyewitnesses. He's simply giving you a story that he's heard about something happened 40 years earlier. That is the basis for a fact. Is this how historians do their work? I mean, obviously, look, none of these apologists is a historian. I don't think any of them has read any historiography. I don't think that they know. Maybe William Lane Craig has. I don't know. I mean, but he certainly doesn't work like any other historian works. You cannot use the kind of criteria that he uses for the historical Jesus to do ancient history or to do medieval history or any other kind of history.
So the basic point here that he's trying to bring up is, and we'll forget the ad hominems against Christian apologists for a second, but the kind of dating around the statement of Joseph of Arimathea taking Jesus's body and burying it in his own family tomb. He'll say, look, this is a story that appears first in Mark's gospel, and Mark was written 70 AD or CE, depending on your sort of philosophical persuasion, which is 40 years supposedly after the death of Jesus. He said, that's the first mention we have, so why should we take this seriously as any kind of historical fact? And this is where you see kind of the tie in them with the dating of the Gospels as to whether or not we can trust what's written in the Gospels. So how would you think about the dating of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and whether it's important in the credibility case?
Yeah, I mean, Bart's throwing out a lot of stuff there. And so, I mean, there's so many different ways that I could address it. As far as the dating goes, the reason why Bart and a lot of other scholars are going to date it past like 80, 70 or longer is just because they assume that the prophecies about the temple must be ex eventu or like after the fact. And so they'll just not necessarily say it in so many words, but they'll probably accuse me of like representing a straw man here, but they'll just be like, well, Jesus couldn't have predicted that. And so therefore this really shows that it's probably older because of some of the language that's reflected in the prediction of the temple and just, different things like that. But the problem with that is that the prophecy language looks like it's written, like it doesn't look like it's really written before the event, like they're trying to say, or after the event, excuse me. And so when they say things like you read in Mark chapter 13, pray that it doesn't happen in winter or the Sabbath. Well, the temple was destroyed in the summer. Okay. Or, so that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Also, there's the whole idea that like predicting the destruction of the temple, like how difficult would that really have been? There's another Jewish person who is recorded in Josephus. I'm blanking on the name. I believe it's Jesus ben Ananias, who predicts the destruction of the temple in the 60s. And so this is something that has happened before. I mean, in Jewish history and different things like that. And so that might be why he's dating it late. But for me, I mean, like I said, there's a couple of different ways that I could go here, but for me, I think that Luke's gospel probably dates to the early 60s. And the biggest reason for that is that Acts just ends on this complete cliffhanger. And if you follow Luke's gospel, or excuse me, Luke and Acts, but especially Acts, it's all about court scenes. I mean, right from James and John and Peter being called out onto the carpet in front of the Sanhedrin in chapter 3, and then you see it again in chapter 4. And then you see Paul is basically becomes the main character of the story at around chapter 13, and he gets in trouble with the Jews. And then you see him in all kinds of court scenes before Agrippa, giving his case before the Jews in chapter 22. It's like a repeated theme. And he appeals to Caesar, but he never appears to Caesar in the book, right? It's just like, okay, well, that's kind of strange. And I've heard some people say, like, in response to this, well, this is just kind of like an argument from silence, is it? And to that, I would just respond and say, no, this is an argument from the purpose of the book. Luke likes court scenes. He's interested in court scenes. And we're just left with Paul in Rome, having appealed to Caesar, finally getting to Rome after surviving a shipwreck. And then we don't get anything about it at all. That's just a very strange way to end this book. And this isn't just like a conservative apologist talking point. Adolf von Harnack, who was a very liberal Christian, didn't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, definitely didn't have a lot of conservative ideas at all, more of a liberal critic. And this is what flipped him on that. And so if Acts predates Luke, then Luke was probably written in the late 50s. And if Luke is using Mark, as a lot of these scholars would agree, then Mark predates that. So he could be in the 50s. You even have atheist New Testament scholars like James Crossley and Maurice Casey, who have dated Mark into the early 40s. And so late dating by itself isn't really all that difficult. But the other thing is let's just say that this is an older story, right? Well, Bart is just saying, well, they're not eyewitnesses. Okay, well, you have to, I know this is just a TikTok and it's just a clip from Apologia video, and he has his own case on why they're eyewitnesses, but I would just push back on that and say, no, these are from eyewitnesses. And if Mark is a spiritual son and somebody who's recording Peter's testimony, which is what all the earliest church tradition attests to, and we have reasons to think that Mark's gospel is a reliable account of somebody who is close up to the facts and is knowledgeable and is habitually truthful, then what is so difficult about knowing who buried Jesus? Why is that such a do you think Peter, I don't know, some guy buried him? I have no idea. And so I know, Bart is going to make his own case on why he doesn't think Jesus was buried and all that other stuff. But he says very kind of smugly and condescendingly in that video, this isn't the way historians do history. Yet Ehrman uses a lot of the same criteria that Craig does and everything else like that. I would take a different approach, and I would just take more of a holistic approach to Mark's gospel and make a case that it is a reliable eyewitness account on every turn. And classical historians do talk about whole document reliability. And when somebody is consistently telling you the truth over and over and over again, you don't just throw every pericope into this box of we have to be skeptical of it until we can throw a bunch of different historical criteria to show that it's true. No, if he's constantly showing that he's knowledgeable and honest and all those other things, then you trust the document. And what there's not even a supernatural claim being made here. It's just a guy who buried Jesus. This isn't necessarily anything that's prima facie low probability. They could push back on that a little bit, I'm sure. But that would just be doing some a priori history. And anyways, I could ramble on and on about it, but yeah,
that's super helpful.
Yeah, this is bad.
Yeah, it's super helpful just to think too the connection between, if we were to say let's 30 or 33 AD for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, and then even at 70 AD, that's 37 to 40 years, which is still kind of within living memory. You're still having at that point apostles who were around in the ancient empire who were acting as custodians over the content, even with the later dating assumed for a book like Mark, for instance. And I think it is an interesting question around how would we consider the oral retelling of stories. That certainly is another kind of factor in determining the reliability of these accounts.
Well, do we just throw out testimony because it's 40 years old? I mean, we still, we have books or memoirs written from Holocaust victims who are writing in their 70s and 80s. We don't just go, oh, well, it's too old, you can't remember. No, you're just going to have to
Yeah.
argue. You're going to have to argue, and Bart is going to accept a date of 70-ish AD for Mark's gospel. So he's just going to have to make a different argument, and I know that he does, obviously, that these documents are not written by anybody who has any access to eyewitnesses whatsoever. And I would just push back on the contrary. There's a strong case that can be made for that. Like you said, you plugged a video where you talked to Wes and Mike about that particular topic. And so positive data is going to push back on all of that.
Yeah, so really worth checking out then what is the evidence for the eyewitness testimony being included within Mark as well as the other Gospels. And maybe let's jump to the next one then, because I think it ties in well just around that theme of the reliability of memory and of oral testimony, and whether or not the passage of time means that these stories are going to develop and change almost like legends. Because there's a great clip where Alex O'Connor is talking about the resurrection stories in the Gospels and how he reckons they get more fanciful over time, which is clear evidence of a progression of the retelling, and this oral testimony therefore isn't ultimately reliable. So let's check that.
Post-resurrection appearances, and then the Gospel of Matthew does include post-resurrection appearances. The Gospel of Luke includes even more. It's only in the Gospel of John that we get, for instance, Doubting Thomas, which is the latest gospel, canonical gospel, I should say. That's where that arises. And in fact, the story of Doubting Thomas, famously, he doesn't believe that it's the risen Christ, and Jesus says, "Come and touch my wounds," and he touches his wounds and he says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says, "You believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing." So in my view, what we have is this so-called mythological development of no post-resurrection appearances, and as the time goes on, as we get further away from the source, the stories get more fantastical, ending in a moral lesson to believe without evidence. Seeing. Yes, this to me does seem a little bit suspicious.
Yeah.
All right, where do you want to go with that one?
I mean, there's so many frustrating things there. And so first of all, yeah, Bart Ehrman really likes to make this argument, and Alex has Bart on his channel a lot, and I think he uses a lot of his arguments and other people's arguments. And so, but anyways, this is very, very cherry picked. And they're, first of all, with Mark's gospel, let's talk about Mark's gospel. He says there's no appearances, right? There's just the appearance of the angels, and he's basically, it's like, go to Galilee and Jesus is resurrected, and it just ends there. Well, a lot of scholars, including Bart Ehrman's own person who oversaw his doctoral dissertation and co-wrote several books with him, Bruce Metzger, believed that the long ending of Mark was just lost. And one of the reasons that he says that is because it ends on the Greek participle gar, and there's just no works of ancient history from around that time that end with that. And it's just such a cliffhanger. It's such a weird place to end, right? And there's
so you mean the original ending of Mark as opposed to the long ending
original
of Mark that we
ending.
now
Yeah,
have.
not the long ending of Mark. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I guess I'm assuming people know about that, but not everybody does. But yeah, if you look at most of your Bibles, it says that, you know, there's
verses 9 to 20 are not in any of the originals that they're, and they do like kind of summarize the other stories that you see across Matthew, Luke, and John in that regard. So the scholars don't see that to be an original, but see it to be an addition that later scribes put on there to try and round out what seems like a very unnatural ending, with it finishing at verse 8. And that's what you were saying, that some scholars are saying originally there was a different ending on there that was lost from the copy of Mark's gospel that would have been the original that was copied.
Right. And I mean, this isn't just like a fringe position. Like, I believe N.T. Wright holds this view. I know Robert Gundry definitely does. I definitely know, like, Bruce Metzger, who is like the king of textual criticism. I mean, you know, and so, like, we don't necessarily, there's a good probability we don't know what the appearances were like. And even then, like, even if it does end there, it's still Jesus saying, you know, in multiple places that he's going to resurrect and to meet him in Galilee, and that's where they'll see him. So, and so, but before Mark's gospel, we do have the letters of Paul. And so, like, let's just say you want to make like a argument that it's like a numerical development, like no appearances, like Alex says, and then, you know, the appearances become more numerically and more in type, you know, like in terms of details and different things like that. And so let's just look at like numerical development. Okay, well, Paul is earlier than Mark. He says that Mark has none, then Matthew, Luke, and John have progressively more appearances, but this fails because Paul actually lists more appearances than any other gospel, 6, right? He talks about to himself, to James, to Peter, to the 500, and to the 12. Okay, so there's multiple appearances there. And so Luke and John actually don't have more appearances than Paul. If anything, they condense the list into selected stories. If he wants to say like there's more physical and material development, which he does, he's like, okay, by the time you get to John, he's like, touch me if you want to, which was kind of strange that he brought that up as like, it's just belief without evidence. Like, that's not what he was saying. He's saying the evidence is the apostles' testimony. If you actually read the Gospel of John, that's what he's talking about. We accept evidence based on people's testimony all the time. It's just not direct evidence, like.
And so he's chiding Thomas for not being willing to accept the eyewitness testimony of the rest of the 12.
Exactly. Yeah. He's chiding Thomas for he already had seen so many miracles. He already knew about Jesus' predictions of his resurrection. And so it's just kind of a silly interpretation of that. But at any rate, if you want to say there's more physical material development in the later Gospels, like Paul is kind of vague and Mark doesn't really give you anything. And then it escalates to where Jesus is eating fish, showing his wound and getting touched in, like, say, Luke and John. Well, I think that fails because Matthew, the second gospel, does have physical details. Jesus is touched by women. There's also a post-earthquake appearance that is not in any of the other gospels. There's also guards at the tomb, which is not in any other gospels. And so if this is like some sort of development hypothesis, like, we would expect like increasingly more, including all these other details, and we don't. And then Paul, he's not denying any physicality. He's just citing a creed. He's not giving any sort of negative or narrative detail. And there's so what I'm saying is there's just no linear pattern. Matthew has more physical details than Luke in some respects, right? Again, with the earthquake, the guards, and different things like that. Also, Jesus's walks through walls could be seen as kind of like less physical in a sense, because it's like it's just kind of more of a spiritual experience or what. And so, and then, he might say, well, maybe like there's more theological development, like John's latest gospel has the highest Christology, with Thomas saying, my Lord, my God, and all this other kind of stuff. But again, right in the second gospel, we have a Trinitarian baptismal formula after the resurrection.
Yeah, true.
Which is like very, very developed. Like,
that's the most developed out of the 3. Yeah.
Theological, where he's like literally putting the Trinity right there. And then Paul, of course, equates Jesus with Yahweh and all kinds of passages, like in Philippians chapter 2 with the Carmen Christi, or just Romans 10:9-10, where whoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. He's quoting Joel chapter 2 verses 32, and he's saying Jesus is that Lord. He's Yahweh. And so John's theology is more explicit, but the content is really already there earlier. And so, I just don't see the pattern here. He's cherry picking in order to create patterns, and that's what these guys tend to do. The Gospels just don't really follow a clean trajectory from less to more. There's no consistent pattern across all the categories, like physicality, number, theology. And so they're just having to cherry pick details in order to get this. And they do this with a number of different stories. You'll hear Bart Ehrman say, well, the Gospels become increasingly more anti-Semitic the further you go to John. And it's like, okay, like, no, they don't. They actually omit a lot of the, like, your blood be upon us and upon our children is in the second gospel. That's the one that, like, the rabid anti-Semite weirdos like to latch onto that one. And that's in the second gospel, and you don't see that at all in John's gospel. And so these development patterns, and Lydia McGrew did an excellent series on this on our YouTube channel, are just highly cherry-picked and gerrymandered and just fall apart.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful actually to do what Bart so often encourages people to do, and actually put these things side by side and then review what are the developments, what are the number of appearances, what are the stories like, and put Paul in that as well in terms of the timeline. And it does seem to be a thesis that falls apart, but it's maybe playing on this idea that we think of the development of the Jesus stories where people have a tradition that they've received and they pass it on, but that in this oral retelling from person to person, place to place, that story could just be expanding, whether it's the telephone game or whether it's the fishing stories that grandpa tells. It's like it gets more elaborate every single time. What do you make of the reliability of oral tradition, given that, okay, at best then maybe Mark was written in the late 40s, that's still nearly 2 decades of this story being passed around orally. There may have been preceding notes that they'd taken who works or whatever, but for the most part, oral tradition seems to be the way that these things are spread. Should we be suspicious of these stories being passed from one place to another, or is there mechanisms that within the nature of the oral traditions that are there can guard that content from becoming overtaken by legendary material?
I mean, I don't really worry about the whole idea of oral tradition in the Gospels because they're written by people who are witnesses or companions of witnesses. And so John claims to be a witness explicitly in his gospel, and there's all kinds of evidence. You've had Lydia on, like you said, talking to her about the Gospel of John. There's tons of eyewitness detail that this is actually somebody who's right there with a front row seat to the ministry of Jesus and everything else like that. And so, and then you have Luke's gospel, which, no, he's not an eyewitness, but he specifically says that he's interviewing eyewitnesses right at the outset. There is an overwhelming abundance of evidence that he is a traveling companion of Paul. There's just all kinds of details, historical, external confirmations, things that we know about where they traveled and how it's corroborated with archaeology and all kinds of other different things that we know from history, inscriptions, other historical works, and different things like that. And then the way that the stories dovetail perfectly with Paul's letters in ways that are just like really undesigned and surprising, and clearly aren't the result of copying, that this is somebody who's a witness. And so if that's the case, in Acts chapter 21, and I believe it's 17 and 18, it says that he was there when all the, because when Paul was arrested and under house arrest or whatever, and he was in, not house arrest, but he was under arrest, he was in Jerusalem. This is in the middle of the we passages. So this person's traveling with them. He's with Paul in Jerusalem. And it says that Paul was able to talk to James, and all the other elders were present. Well, who does Paul refer to as the Jerusalem elders in Galatians chapter 1 and 2? It's Peter, James, John. This is an opportunity for Luke to meet and actually speak with and interview apostles, including Jesus' own family members. And even earlier in Acts chapter 21, it says that he spent some time with Philip the deacon, which may plausibly be where he extracted his information about Philip's doings in Samaria in Acts chapter 8. And so, and there's tons of evidence that supports this, and I have a whole playlist of videos on that. But he had every opportunity to talk to witnesses. And so this isn't just like oral tradition that's being spread from one person to another person and just like these different narrations in a long chain. And they're just trying to really safeguard this. This is him talking to actual
the beginning
people.
of the chain.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the chain. Exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I believe that we can say similar things about some of the other gospels as well. And so, yeah, I don't think Christians, sometimes we fall into this trap as apologists that we have to really strongly defend oral tradition. I think we need to strongly defend just that these are written by witnesses, and we have an abundance of evidence that supports that. Or people who are companions of the witnesses.
Now, do you think memory plays into that? So, okay, let's say then it's not oral development because it's passing from one person to another and the story slightly changed. But what about the value of memory after 30, 40, 50 years for the apostles? Should that be something that causes people concern? Then could the apostles really remember the things that Jesus said? Could they really remember who was there present and how it played out? Or does time override the reliability of those memories, and you end up projecting on a story that you didn't really happen? What do you make of the value of memory in being able to pass that on?
Sure. Well, I mean, eyewitness memory, people try to attack it and say that it's weak. But if you actually look at the studies where it talks about eyewitness testimony being unreliable, they're usually talking about like crime scenes where it's like a brief, confusing, frightening episode where there's a weapon present and, it's over in a short period of time. And we're talking about a group of Jesus's followers who were with him for 3 years. I mean, I could tell you a lot of the things that my pastor would repeatedly say over and over. He's going from town to town as an itinerant minister. He's probably repeating a lot of the same messages and sermons and different things like that, because it's a whole new audience every single time. And so you start to hear the same stories. And if you even look at the way like Jesus teaches, if you've ever read, like, say, I don't know, where Jesus talks about worry. I mean, it's just such a memorable thing that it's not difficult to really kind of remember that. Like my children can probably quote that passage to you just because they've heard it so often. But more importantly, going back to eyewitness details concerning, say, miracles. Well, these are things that are not just I'm around a stranger and this brief, confusing episode happened in this dark place where there was danger present. No, this is their beloved rabbi who they spent 3 years with. I think if your friend died who you spent 5 years with or whatever, and he came back, you would be able to identify him if you saw him again, right? And it wasn't just this one-time thing, but if you look at the gospel details, if those do go back to eyewitnesses, they're reporting that he ate with them, that he invited them to touch his wounds, that they spoke in groups, that this was extended over a period of 40 days. And so those are things that are very difficult to be mistaken about, right? And so a lot of times with the miracle claims, they're not things that are just these vague, weird things that you could see just kind of remembering totally different, 40 years later, memory. I don't know.
Certain things stick with you in a big way. And
I
think it's important events like my wedding or my baptism or graduations, or I remember those moments with incredible clarity, or where you are when you've learned really important things from people that you admire. Totally could rehash many of those conversations, even though I haven't done it for 5 or 10 years, let alone if I was recounting every week or a few weeks those stories, to be able to pass them on to others. It keeps those memories even more fresh, So I've always just found that a bit of a strange argument to just hand wave away the reliability of human memory in that way.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Well, let's jump to another one, because if we do have, let's say, those 4 gospels side by side, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you've got what Bart was saying was development across them. Here's another criticism that he brings with respect to then, okay, what about where these details do seem to differ, supposed contradictions in the gospels? So this raises why they're 4, why do they contradict if they're meant to tell true stories? Doesn't that call at least one, if not all of them, into question? I'll click this up.
With my students, they know the Christmas story, the wise men, and you get the shepherds. Have them read Matthew and just make a list of what happens in Matthew. This. Then I have them read Luke and make the same list for Luke. And is there anything that cannot be reconciled? It blows their minds. You realize, whoa, after Jesus is born, Mary has to make an offering in the temple. And then they go straight back to Nazareth, which is about 100 miles to the north up in Galilee. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is born and Joseph is warned that Herod is now going to try and kill the child. And so Joseph takes the family and goes down to Egypt, and they stay there till Herod dies. When they hear that Herod dies, they come back. They can't resettle in Bethlehem like they want. They resettle in Nazareth. If Matthew is right that they went down to Egypt for months or years or however long, how can Luke be right that they immediately returned to Nazareth?
And what is the answer to that question from
I
the
don't
perspective
know.
of a Christian?
I don't know. I mean, you have to make something up.
So this is, again, just an opportunity maybe to speak to gospel contradictions more broadly, because this is one of the key criticisms that's brought. Okay, you want to say that these gospels are reliable, that they record eyewitness testimony, but what about the contradictions, the spots where the gospels make statements that are hard to reconcile? So what do you do with gospel contradictions?
Well, I mean, let's answer this specific contradiction, because actually I'll give Bart some credit on this particular one. This is one of the more thornier contradictions in the gospels. Now, if you look at Bart's list normally, how many angels were at the tomb? Was it 2? Was it 1? How many women and all this other stuff? Those are really easy and kind of silly and not difficult contradictions to reconcile. And so, but in any kind of historical study, we do sensible harmonization if we can. we don't want strained harmonization. We don't want to just make up ad hoc excuses and arguments and different things like that. But like eyewitness testimony from one person to the next is going to like differ at least a little bit in some like minor details, right? And so, but like let's just say there were like a handful of contradictions that weren't like necessarily like trying to that aren't the result of like they're obviously making stuff up and that's why they contradict, but they just could be like because of a memory lapse or a good faith mistake or something like that. And so let's just say for the sake of argument, not putting aside the whole question of inerrancy and all that other kind of stuff, but just looking at the text like historians, Luke, this particular objection or this particular contradiction, Luke skips over the Magi, Herod, and Egypt. He doesn't deny it. He just moves straight from the temple to Nazareth, right? Now, I think it's very plausible that Luke's source here was Mary for the reasons that I just gave earlier. He had access to Jesus's family. He may have had access to Mary as well. And so she definitely plays a very large role in his gospel and is even mentioned in Acts as being present in the upper room. It's possible that Luke was just summarizing the post-temple years quickly. He does skip over time a lot. Like he doesn't end his gospel with 40 days of resurrection appearances. We see that later when we get to Acts. Well, I don't think Luke is just blatantly trying to contradict himself. I think he's just compressing at the particular moment. Then there's also like 3 years missing after Paul's conversion, like that we read about in Galatians. But if you're just reading Acts chapter 9, you wouldn't get the idea that there's 3 years that actually went by. But it doesn't mean clearly with the abundance of evidence that we do know that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, which would be a whole other show. And I've done that like on with Vocab Malone, and if people really want to look that up. But it could be that he's just compressing time. Okay, now that's not an error. That's just a type of literary device, I guess, if you will. But even if there is a contradiction, it would just be a minor human error, because like Lydia McGrew, who's not an inerrantist, suggests that this is just an assumption on Luke's part based on his source's structure, and maybe he just didn't know. Like maybe he just didn't know that like about the flight to Egypt. Maybe she just passed over that. She didn't mention it for whatever reason. Maybe it was a painful experience in her life. She didn't want to talk about it, whatever. And Luke just assumed like, oh, okay, well, I guess afterwards, and they went there and blah, 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 blah. And so like, would that just by itself be like, okay, well, these aren't historical documents of any credibility. We just got to throw them away. Well, if we did that, then we're going to throw out all kinds of ancient history, like there's all kinds of historical narratives that have like major contradictions in terms of lots of different things. Like that's just not the way testimony works. That's just not the way history works. And so, yeah, it's just, we have to, even if, like I said, with the Gospels, like if there are some kind of like variations, contradictions of some sort, and we can apply a little bit of charity and just go, I don't think that they were just lying. I don't think that they were just like making up a story. Like Matthew just made up a story about this flight to Egypt and it never really happened. And what Luke says is actually true, because, the whole story of the flight to Egypt, that's so much more dramatic. And Matthew can probably pull out a cool prophecy out there and throw in Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt, I called my son, and all this other kind of stuff. I don't think that's what he's doing. In fact, I think there's very good historical plausibility of the flight to Egypt, and we can talk about that if you want. But yeah, I don't, hopefully I'm making sense there, but
yeah, definitely. I think that's really helpful walking through that particular example, just to say, look, here's a couple of options that are on the table in terms of thinking about it. If you wanted to force harmonization, it might be a bit strained in this case, although that can often work in other scenarios. But maybe there's just a literary device that's going on here. He's just compressing time and skipping over that scene, or maybe he's just unaware of the flight to Egypt, and therefore acts as though they went simply from Bethlehem straight up to Nazareth rather than going southwest to escape Herod until he died. So I think they're helpful, just giving people the options that are on the table for how you process those sorts of things in ways that don't immediately remove all historical credibility. And I think maybe that's part of the concern here, is that so-called contradictions in the text give us a reason to distrust them entirely. If there's a contradiction between these 4 accounts, well, then you can't trust any of them. And it seems to be that's an assumption that doesn't follow. So what would be your general encouragement then if people are going through the 4 Gospels horizontally, as Bart suggests there, and they're listing out all the details of different miracle events or a different structure of when Jesus went certain places, and they're noticing, hey, there's some differences here. What might be a run of things you'd encourage people to go through in order to try and think about those differences in the Gospels?
Well, Bart will often just kind of leave out some key details and put things in like the most negative light possible. So my recommendation would just not take Bart's word for it. Like you said, like actually write them down yourself and go through the text yourself. And then just, like I said, just do reasonable harmonization if you can. And so harmonization is a good standard historical practice that classical historians use. It's not an apologist technique in order to, make excuses for why we can trust the Gospels. That's not the case. And in some cases, like when you can harmonize accounts, when in a way that's not stretchy, and that's actually a hallmark of eyewitness testimony. And so what you have to do is you have to look in the background of what are all the positive reasons that I can trust these accounts, right? And when you have multiple reasons for why the Gospels are reliable, and they show themselves to be people who are present or who had access to people who were present, and then when you do see a variation or something like that, you just reconcile it. It's not that really that big of a deal. And if you can't, like in this particular case where it might be a little bit more difficult, then, is this like, do these contradict because they're just making up stories and like they just can't get them to fit together? Or do they just contradict because it could be like a good faith error of like, somebody had a memory lapse or something like that? It's not really like we have to assume that like because there's a contradiction, it's an invented story. That's silly. That's not how courtrooms work. You know what I mean? And
you would kind of assume that if it was an invented story, they would be trying to harmonize it with the other stories that were already available. So they're not raising contradictions in the first place.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, you would think that. And so especially this whole idea that these critics will create is like, well, they're just like very, very, very carefully copying Mark's gospel. And then just anything that's a variation off of that is them just kind of making up a story. Well, if that's the case, then you would also be careful too. And so you can't really, and not make sure they contradict. And so you can't really have your cake and eat it too. It's kind of weird. And so, anyways, hopefully that
if people want to check more out about that, in the video that we did with Wes Huff and with Mike Jones, I'll link down the bottom. The section we do on undesigned coincidences is sort of fascinating of these 4 Gospels and just different interlocking incidental details that help shed light on curiosities that one may raise, but it's seemingly unintentionally just by passing details in a different gospel. We've just got a comment here from Jacko Schwartz, who says, the one objection I've seen a lot in recent videos is the different endings of Mark. I know Red Pen Logic has addressed those a lot for people, but for people who don't follow him, could you touch on those? So yeah, Tim Bunnett's been on the channel a bit as well. He's a good guy, but we actually did this a little bit back. If you go back in the stream, maybe 20, 30 minutes, Jacko, Erik speaks a little bit about the longer ending of Mark, how verses 9 to 20 in our modern Bibles is almost always bracketed out, says that this section was not found in the original manuscripts and seems to be sort of a later scribal addition, just summarizing the resurrection stories in the other 3 Gospels. But that seems to be because they recognize that verse 8 cuts off awkwardly and that it's like there was a different original ending of Mark that has been lost. And even the way that some of the earliest manuscripts that we have leave this big blank space in that area suggests that may be exactly where a longer ending that once existed has been lost. And so it's probably the case that it doesn't just finish with the women running off scared as sort of a sermon cliffhanger at the end of Mark's gospel, but there was originally more content there. Even still, go check out how that interacts with sort of the plausibility of the resurrection accounts. We chatted about that maybe half an hour ago. All right, well, let's jump to the next one if we can. I'll just click that off. This one, well, watch it and we'll go.
Jesus that's any different than the other gods or any other fictional heroes for that matter. First of all, there's no empirical evidence that he was divine. In that sense, he shares it with every other god that's ever been proposed. The myths associated with Jesus are associated with all the other myths, and the Bible. The flood myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written well before the Bible, exactly the same. The hero of the Bible was asked to create an ark and put all the species 2 by 2 on 7 levels. Same thing. Virgin birth, nothing special about Jesus. Oh, look at all these. They're all supposed to have been born of virgins. The whole story, in fact, take Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, versus Jesus. It's exactly the same. They were both born from a virgin mother. They were fathered by the king of heaven. They returned from the dead. They transformed water into wine. In fact, they, talked about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator. They were taken as a liberator of mankind. That story has been told over and over again, and this is just one of the most recent renderings.
So this is a really common objection that you'll see. Let's forget maybe the Old Testament stuff about the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood story and whether Genesis is written in response to ancient pagan mythologies. But let's jump to the Gospels, because this is certainly something you'll see all the time, that Christmas is a pagan holiday that just rebrands pagan myths about the virgin birth, that Easter is just a pagan holiday and there's dying and rising gods right throughout the ancient world that the Gospel writers simply co-opt and maybe transpose into a Jewish framework. Would love to get your response. How do we know that the Gospels aren't just plagiarism of ancient myths, but this time with a guy called Jesus?
What's that guy's name? I'm trying to remember. Is that the one?
He's Lawrence Krauss. So
Lawrence Krauss.
What is atheist crowd?
Yeah, what does Lawrence Krauss know about the gospel? Like, stick to physics, but no. I mean, this is just really bad. I mean, if anybody's actually read those accounts, just read the accounts. Read the accounts that he's comparing, and just make a list. Like, I'm not going to get into the specific examples of each one and how they're specious examples. I mean, I did do a stream not that long ago with Inspiring Philosophy, where he was responding to Derek Lambert from Myth Vision about all the Dionysius parallels, and they're just, I mean, I can't really put this like nicely. They're incredibly stupid. They're not good parallels at all. Like, they're terrible. But the thing that I would want to focus on and emphasize here is that the gospel writers are claiming to write historiography, right? Right at the offset, like Luke's prologue, as we already talked about later, he emphasizes eyewitnesses, right? He's not writing folklore. He's not writing, some kind of myth or anything else like that. The only reason to say that is like, okay, well, there's supernatural elements and dying and rising gods, and there's parallels and all this other kind of stuff. Okay, well, like, again, those examples aren't very good. But number two, like, this is just basically like, okay, there's supernatural stuff in this, so it must be folklore. I think that's really what Krauss is trying to say. But if you actually look at the details in the accounts of the Gospels, they're obviously very clearly historical. So, like, going back to Luke, okay, in his prologue, he says, this is what I'm doing. I'm interviewing witnesses, people who were apostles and eyewitnesses of the word. Like, there's other people who have taken accounts to write what happened from the beginning. And then from the very beginning, he's dropping all kinds of like people, times, and places that we can historically confirm, right? And sure, like, there's people named, like, if you go to the 3rd chapter and it talks about who was Caesar at that time and who was the high priest and all of these other different things and what year it started and all that other stuff. But it's like far more granular than that, right? And so, like, in the book of Acts, there's actually 84 different confirmable external things from history that we know about, like local customs, ports, sea routes, just different things, people, like I was working on a video today where like, we know that Sergius Paulus, who Paul meets in Acts chapter 13, was like a real person because we have an inscription of that. Not only that, but like the place where Paul goes after he talks to Sergius Paulus on the island of Cyprus, he goes to Antioch, Pisidia, where there is another person from the Paulus family. Well, just think about it for a second. If he just witnessed this amazing miracle from Paul of him turning a man blind and him being converted and hearing the gospel, he might be interested in his family hearing about it. So it does make sense, but actually Acts never really tells us that, but we can kind of reasonably infer that that's a pretty fair possibility that actually happened, right? Or taking another example, Acts chapter 14, right? Where Paul heals a crippled man, and basically everybody comes out and they're all freaking out and they're speaking in the Lycaonian dialect, right?
Mm.
Well, like most people spoke Greek in the area, and so like, what's up with this Lycaonian dialect? Well, we know from different inscriptions, and again, this goes back to the work that Colin Hemmer, a classical historian, did. Like, no, we know from inscriptions and different things that like they did speak Lycaonian there. That was one place there where that language was spoke. And then another thing, when they say, hey, Zeus and Hermes have come down, and they thought that Paul was Zeus, and no, the other way around. Barnabas was Zeus and Paul was Hermes. That tracks too, because those were actually the patron gods of that particular area that we know from archaeological inscriptions and different things like that, or even Ovid's Metamorphoses. I probably might be butchering that name a little bit there. And not only that, we know in their particular understanding, the reason why they thought that Paul was Hermes and not Zeus is because the less important god would be
the spokesperson.
The spokesperson, yeah. And so, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg. That's just 2 chapters. There are, like I said, over 84 different details that Hemmer tracks. There's all kinds of interlocking details between Paul's letters and Acts, but Paul's letters clearly, the writer of Acts doesn't seem to have access to Paul's letters, because in other places there's just different variations. I can give examples if you want. And so it's like, when I hear stuff like this, I'm like, have you actually read the Gospels? And have you actually read these myths? Because it sounds to me like you're just going weird stuff, supernatural stuff, and I can kind of make these vague parallels. Therefore, this is the kind of literature they are, but these are very clearly like not what they proclaim to be, and they were not understood this way in the early church. Justin Martyr calls them memoirs, right? And so they're received as historical documents. And so it's just kind of odd that like everybody in the early church like completely misunderstood the genre of these stories. It doesn't. This is kind of the low IQ side of. I mean, I'm not saying Lawrence Krauss is low IQ, but this is a low IQ kind of objection. Like people, like even Ehrman is not going to make stupid arguments like these. Like he's
super helpful, man.
These arguments are bunk. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, like you said, just go and read them. I remember reading Osiris, who gets chopped up by Seth into 14 pieces and hidden across Egypt, and then Isis regathers all the pieces and Frankenstein's him together, except for his phallus, which he fashions out of gold, and just to be able to reanimate his body in the underworld to sleep with them. And you're like, that's meant to be linked to the resurrection of Jesus,
just like Christianity.
It's totally exactly the same thing. But in addition to that, even if there was some similarities across the accounts, like you said, they anchor this in history, and they're really cautious to try and say, this is when it happened, this is who was there, these are the witnesses, this is how we can believe it. So correlation doesn't equal causation either, in that respect. Just on that, so there's these we mentioned again in the contradictions bit before, maybe even the potential that, let's say, if you want to move away from inerrancy, that the gospel authors could have made good faith errors or mistakes potentially. Is that the case when it comes to factual errors? Because you just mentioned a bunch of things, for instance, that marks a verisimilitude with Luke Acts, and then the world that we know at the time, ways we can test, yes, this maps onto reality. But what about where, for instance, in Luke's recounting of the birth of Jesus, he speaks about this is the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor, and we've got the birth of Jesus happening somewhere sort of 4 to 7 BC. But you've got later records of Quirinius being governor, probably a decade after that in the region as to when a census is done. What do you make of those sorts of statements where, is this historical error? How should people regard that when it comes up?
Oh, well, with the census, I don't think that one's a historical error at all. I mean, it does say that there was I have a few videos on this, one of them responding to Dan McClellan in particular, if people want to check that out, to get a more detailed kind of thing. I won't rehash the whole thing here, but it's kind of funny how the skeptics will present that. And so first of all, like, is Luke really that stupid that he's going to just like invent a census out of whole cloth that he knows didn't happen? Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And usually the motive that they're going to attribute to Luke is that he's trying to get some sort of an excuse to get
To
Jesus'
get
family
them
to
into
Bethlehem
Bethlehem.
to fulfill the prophecy of Micah 5:2. And it's like, why don't you just have them go there? Why would you invent this like really complicated, like
Yeah. It's
unnecessary
called
plot device?
family Passover celebrations or something like
Yeah,
that. Just
that
something
any
easy.
yeah, that anybody could just call you out. Like Luke probably knew how censuses worked. He probably was part of them. The people who were reading his gospel were probably part of them. Nobody is raising this as an objection, and I don't want to make like an argument from silence, but you would think like Celsus or somebody who was really like anti-Christian would bring like, no, like this never happened. Like you don't see that, right? It's only until like the modern days they're like, oh no, there's no way that could have possibly happened, even though like in the decrees of the divine Augustus that there was a census that was rolled out, and that we do know from history that censuses could take like several years, up to 8 years, and all of this other stuff. And there's so many other details that I give in the video. It's just a really tired and stupid objection. But again, like if you're going to invent a story to get Jesus out of Nazareth into Bethlehem, this is like using like a jackhammer to crack open a walnut. Like it's like so stupid. Like just have him go there for some other reason. And so I don't think that he's inventing it for a lot of different reasons. I think it is anchored in history. People read way into the text and act like, oh, the whole Roman world had to go to the birthplace of their ancestors from thousands of years ago, and like how would they even know that? And it's like, you're overreading like the text. That's not what it says. That's actually touted as like one of the best objections against Luke, and I actually find it the weakest. And so again, just see my response to Dan McClellan on that. It's a couple years older. Maybe you could put it in the show notes later for all of the details. But on the face of it, it's like, how stupid do you think the gospel writers are? It's just like, it blows my mind at some of the ways that like critics just assume like utter sheer gullibility and stupidity on the gospel writers and their audience.
But that's at one level, and then the other one is, but also they're inventing this moral genius, Jesus of Nazareth, and the redemptive encounters and the sublime moral teachings. So they're simultaneously just making massive blunders, whilst at the same time being literary luminaries. Like
right, and that's
pick a lane.
Yeah, pick a lane for sure. And so that's what it blows my mind about it. You're right. Is that on one hand, they want to say that like these guys are just bumbling idiots. And on the other hand, they're like these literary geniuses. And it's like the reportage model that I'm throwing out there is like, no, it's more of a unified view where they're honest. They know what they're talking about. They're intelligent. They're close up to the facts. And it just makes way more sense than just like all of this other, more complicated theory, like that they're just like making stuff up at one moment and they're getting all these subtle little details correct. But then the next moment they're complete, bozos who can't get their story straight. I mean,
and I mean, in some areas, this is almost an argument from silence to some degree as well, because we just don't have the historical data of the records to be able to prove it. But
Josephus could be wrong. I mean, God forbid, Josephus might make a mistake too. Like,
that's a really good point. But is it the sort of thing though where you come across something there, you have no ability to offer external verification? We have no other ancient sources or archaeological artifacts to be able to verify something. Should then it be treated with suspicion in your view, or do you think there's good reason to say, well, look, here's something don't know what to make of yet, but let's just wait to see what gets dug up over time or what other texts are found, and otherwise let's just give it the benefit of the doubt. Should we give benefit of the doubt to these ancient authors, or should we treat them with historical suspicion?
Okay, so just like going back to Luke is like one example. If you combine all the external confirmations that Luke gets right, that are just amazing, right? Just absolutely amazing things. And then all of the interlockings with Paul's letters. And so if he's telling you the truth in a way that you can verify like over 100 times, and then there's like one thing that you can't necessarily confirm, or would you get like, if you had a friend who speaks the truth to you way more than they ever speak falsehood, like you're just going to give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. And so it's the same kind of principle, right? Again, this goes back to whole document reliability. That Ehrman was like, oh, I don't know what kind of historians, they don't do this stuff. Like, it's like, no, classical historians do look at whole document reliability. And so when there's somebody is constantly telling you the truth in ways that you can verify, then when there's something else that you're like, I don't really have an external source for that, you don't just go, aha, like I don't have no other corroboration, therefore they made this up. No, you just go,
Yeah.
this guy's a source who's there. They're actually telling me. So like, this is actually a good reason to think that it is true. It's when you have contradiction to the contrary, then you have more of a problem. But yeah.
That's so helpful. Really helpful, mate. Let's jump to another one. This is one around the claims of Jesus. And I guess this probably plays into some of the things we've discussed a little bit, but particularly around Jesus' own self-understanding. So there's another one from Bart talking about whether or not Jesus ever believed or claimed that he was God. And then I'll get your response.
Sure.
Convinced that Jesus never talked about himself as God. We have the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Most scholars today continue to think that Matthew and Luke had access to some other written source of information that they call Q. Matthew has some materials not found in Mark or Luke, so they say, well, that came from some other sources, and Luke has some material not found in Mark and Luke, so that's other sources. Okay, so you got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but you also have Q and M, Matthew special sources, and L, Luke special sources. If you look at all of that material, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Q, M, and L, all of our earliest sources, where Jesus starts calling himself God is the Gospel of John, our last source. It seems to me completely implausible that 6 authors would describe the sayings of Jesus, knowing that he called himself God, and neglect to mention that part. Like that bit just isn't important enough to bring up. So I think it's completely implausible.
So this is maybe calling John's gospel specifically into question, in that it seems to have this theological themes of the great I am sayings, where Jesus is I am the bread of life, or the way, the truth, and the life, or the true vine, or just before Abraham was I am, sort of the classic John 8:58. What's your read on this kind of concern that the earlier gospels don't have Jesus having any sense of being divine, or certainly making that claim for himself? John's gospel does. Does that call John's gospel into question? How do you think about that?
I mean, there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this. One is he is making an argument from silence. Now, if there was like absolutely nothing like what we see in the synoptics in John's gospel, that might cause us to think that. But there actually are lots of pretty maybe not as direct claims like we see in John 8:58, where Jesus calls himself God in that kind of a direct way. But it's still really strong in the synoptics, and we could talk about a few of those examples. But again, it is kind of an argument from silence, and then you have to look at like, well, what is the positive evidence that the Gospel of John is written by an eyewitness? Which, again, I would just punt people to the episode that you did with Lydia on the reliability of the Gospel of John. But like, so we don't want to just throw out John as a source, or be ashamed of John, or act like, he's just this kind of redheaded stepchild or whatever. But he's not problematic, and we don't need to think that he is. But because that was dealt with so well, I'm sure with Lydia, I just don't get it. I mean, in the very prologue of Mark's gospel, Mark basically changes some of the wording around, where John the Baptist is coming, and he's saying, he's quoting Isaiah, and he's quoting Malachi about God coming, and that like the messenger coming before is going to prepare God's way. But then Mark changes it in the prologue to your way, and he's referring to Jesus, right? And so like right at the very outset, this very, the earliest gospel, according to Bart, like calls Jesus God in the first 3 verses. Okay. And so like there goes the whole development hypothesis. But then there's of course Mark, where like the very famous story where the paralyzed man is let down or helped by 4 people. And he sees him and he says, well, son, your sins are forgiven. And the scribes are thinking to themselves, well, only God can do that. And Jesus reads their thoughts, which seems a little bit like omniscience to me. And then says, well, what is it easier to say? Your sins are forgiven, arise up and walk. And then he tells the guy to get up and walk. And he says, I'm doing this to show you that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And it's funny because Bart's pushback on this is like, well, no, it's just like a priestly authority. It is like, I didn't know the Son of Man
They've
was
just
a priest.
yeah.
Like, he doesn't say, well, God said your sins are forgiven and it's okay. Like, I'm speaking on behalf of God. He just says your sins are forgiven. Like, he's speaking from the place of God. And of course, we know from Isaiah and all kinds of different places, Micah 7:18, Isaiah 43:25, that God alone forgives sins. And he links this authority to being the Son of Man. Well, we know who the Son of Man is and who he's referring to in Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14, where the Son of Man rides the clouds, which is something that you see all throughout Deuteronomy and you see all throughout the Psalms, that the person who rides the clouds is Yahweh. And then he receives basically worship and rules an everlasting kingdom. That's the way that it's verbalized there. And what's interesting from the context is if you just go one chapter before where Daniel stays the night with the lions, Darius says the same thing. He says God's kingdom is eternal and indestructible. And then like the very next chapter, the Son of Man's kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, which it's spoken of in exactly the same way. And this Son of Man who is seated with God shares in the honors and the authority and the power of God. Like, and so to me, it's kind of like, Bart, what are you talking about? And that's just Mark's gospel. If we go over to say Matthew, which he would say is the next gospel, Matthew 23:34 through 37, he talks about he's mourning over Jerusalem, and he's very upset. It's getting towards the end of the book where he's about to go to the cross, and it's right before he gives the Olivet Discourse and all of those great parables, and then he's going to go on trial and all that other stuff. He says, and I quote, "I send you prophets." Like, so wait, like in Matthew 23:34, he's talking about sending Jerusalem prophets, but Jesus doesn't say God sends you prophets and you don't listen to them. He says, "I send you prophets."
Yeah, wild.
Yeah, and then he says, "How often I would have gathered your children," and he uses this language of under my wings, but you were not willing. Like, okay, well, that's again, if you look at the Old Testament, if you know your Old Testament, like Psalm 91:4, like where he covers you with his feathers, his pinions, right? Or Deuteronomy 32:11, where it talks about God, covering Israel under his wings. And so Jesus is applying this to himself. He's saying, I sent prophets to you, you rejected them. I would have gathered you under my wings and protect you, as like Yahweh would have been Israel's protector, but you didn't want to listen. And so, like, who says that stuff? Who says that stuff? Like, that seems like to me like a pretty bold and divine claim. And then 2 chapters before that, he cleanses the temple. There's the whole triumphal entry and all this other stuff, and the children start praising Jesus and saying, glory to the Son of David, you're the Messiah, and all this other stuff. And the scribes, they get all angry, they get frustrated. And what does Jesus say in response? And he starts to quote Psalm 8:2, where it's like, out of the mouth of babes you have ordained praise. Well, Psalm 8:2 is about praise being directed towards Yahweh. And yet Jesus is like, I'm not going to tell them to shut up. It's proper that they're directing their praise to me. And he quotes Psalm 8:2, which is a psalm about Yahweh. And so again, Bart, like, who is he talking about? Like, why is he receiving praise that only Yahweh would? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And then one last example, just to cover all 3 gospels. So Luke portrays, and this is also found in Matthew chapter 11, but we see this in Luke chapter 7, 18 through 23. John the Baptist is in prison. He has doubts. He sends some of his, colleagues or whatever to be like, hey, are you the Messiah, or is somebody else to come? And Jesus replies, hey, the blind see, the lame walk, the dead are raised. And, and then he adds this, like a beatitude, blessed are those who are not offended in me. And so it's like, that's kind of interesting. He's quoting Isaiah 35:4 through 6, where it says, your God will come. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened. And so it's the same thing that we saw at the beginning of Mark's gospel again. And Jesus now is speaking it himself. It's not just the author of Mark saying that. It's at least in Jesus' own words, according to
on his own lips.
On his own lips, saying, hey, your God will come. That's me, guys. He cites this miracle as proof that he's a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy about God showing up. And so he doesn't just do what God does. He says that's exactly what's happening. And so I think if people are just reading the Gospels more closely, the Synoptic Gospels in particular, with more of a Jewish lens, because notice that I'm connecting all of these things to the Old Testament. If they're reading it with that lens, like you don't need
It's
him
hard to miss the
necessarily.
headlines. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you don't need him
I
to
don't know
say,
if you saw
"Hey guys, I'm
recently
God."
well, that's the kind of objection that Alex O'Connor brings up recently on Jubilees. He's like, look, if Jesus wanted me to believe that he's God, why doesn't he just say it more explicitly? Like, I want him to say the words, "I am God," and then I would have no problem being able to believe that. What's your read on why he doesn't just put it so blankly in that way?
I
Because
mean, it's
that
the
would
same.
satisfy a lot more Muslims. It would satisfy Unitarians. It would satisfy. Why is it that he's doing it in ways that could be considered wrapped up more with Israel's story and prophetic fulfillment? Why is he being a little bit veiled?
I don't know. I can't really get inside his head. To me, it just seems to like it's the exact word fallacy. Like if you don't say it, like if I am going to, um, I don't know, a college class 5 days a week or whatever, the person never gets up and say, "Hey, I'm Mr. Jones. I'm your professor," or whatever. They never like spoken that exact words, but I already know he's assigned to teach the class. He's the one who my grades depend on. He's the one who's giving the lectures, and he's the one who sets the rules in the class, gives the tests, gives the lessons, assigns the reading, and all this other stuff. He doesn't necessarily need to at that point. It's like just like it's weird. And so I don't know how much clearer he could really like allude to it. I do think that Jesus is kind of speaking in some kind of, in a sense, he's wanting people to piece it together for themselves and connect the dots. But I mean, if you again, like, what would he have been killed for? It says right in Mark 14, he calls himself the Son of Man, and he says that he's going to be riding on the clouds, and that he's going to be seated at the right hand of God in power. And they tore their clothes and they said he is blaspheming. They got it. His Jewish audience got it. And so like we just need to get more, I guess, in their mindset. But again, to me, it's just very nitpicky. When it's like, dude, just like this isn't the kind of reasoning that you would use in normal things. You make inferences all the time, especially when it's like obvious. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a neon sign, "I am God," in order for you to accept it. Just use some common sense, I guess.
Well, let's do another one. Then this one critiques one of the common criteria or arguments that are put forward for the reliability of the Gospels, namely the criterion of embarrassment. Let's check it out.
Called the criterion of embarrassment. What that means is if you're reading an ancient writing and the author is saying something that hurts their own case or is embarrassing to themselves, they're probably telling the truth. Because if they're going to make it up, they wouldn't make up something who's going to hurt their own case or embarrass themselves.
This criterion of embarrassment is used almost exclusively in the realm of New Testament studies, and only rarely in secular history, and for good reasons. The first of which is that it is entirely impossible to know what a specific individual at an entirely different time, in an entirely different culture, would or would not find embarrassing. Projecting our standards for embarrassment onto ancient people would be historically inappropriate.
So this is just trying to undermine the idea that because the Gospels are full of details that would be considered counterproductive as religious propaganda, women discovering the empty tomb, disciples making a fool of themselves, centering on the cross of Jesus, that this is something, it's almost a special pleading that Christians do in defense of the Gospels. It's not really a legitimate criteria when it comes to establishing reliability. What's your take on that critique?
I mean, I don't know if people saw the debate between Robert Spencer and David Wood, but David Wood used the criterion of embarrassment to prove the existence of a historical Muhammad, for which he has plenty of material to work with, because there's a lot of embarrassing details.
A lot of embarrassing content.
Yeah, I won't get into it. It's not safe for a young audience, but like that's just not true. People actually do use the criterion of embarrassment in other studies. I get that that's a religious thing. I think you can't necessarily accuse David Wood or some of these other people necessarily wanting Muhammad to exist. And so, but there are a lot of embarrassing things that are just like too many odd things for this person, this figure to just be made up out of whole cloth, right? Paul Gia was extremely carefully wording that statement there.
Almost entirely in the realm of new. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah. And it's because he's been refuted already by Michael on Inspiring Philosophy on this very point. Now, having said that, the criterion of embarrassment, as well as other things like the criterion of like double dissimilarity or criterion of Semitisms and all of these other things that New Testament scholars use when looking at the text. Yes, they are New Testament scholars, but that doesn't mean that they're all a bunch of Christians. These were really heavily used by, like, say, like the people of the Jesus Seminar, which at best are very liberal Christians. They only accept like 11% or 6% of what's in the Gospels actually can be traced back to Jesus. They don't use their own criterion very consistently. Bart Ehrman himself uses this criterion sometimes, and a lot of, and so, like, I know Gerd Ludemann uses like these different criterion. The reason why this criterion was developed in the first place is it goes back to the more recent quest for the historical Jesus kind of scholars, and it's religiously neutral, and it's used by scholars from all different kind of backgrounds. Now, having said that, I don't use it like they would use it. What they do is they go, okay, like we have a pericope, a story about Jesus. We're going to apply the criterion, all these different criteria, and we're going to deem what really is something that we could say is probably historical, and then we're going to basically be agnostic about anything that doesn't pass the criteria. I think that's a lousy approach to gospel studies, to be honest. So I think you can use embarrassment. Like, I don't think the early church was making up Jesus rebuking Peter and calling him Satan when Jesus said, "I'm going to go to the cross." I think that is an embarrassing
It's a wild
detail.
thought. If one thing is going to tank your credibility as the leader of the early church, is the spokesperson for the apostles, it's getting called Satan by Jesus, right?
Yeah, that's pretty bad, right? And so I don't think they made that up. I think it can be used as to say that, like, okay, I think this is a good reason to believe, like, the fact that they constantly use these embarrassing details is probably a reason to think that, like, something is true. I think it could be a little subjective, like Paulogia says. Maybe some people might not find certain facts embarrassing than others. Maybe the women discovering the empty tomb, for example, wouldn't be embarrassing to the early church, but it does seem to make sense that in a Jewish context where you have rabbis in the Talmud saying that, better for the law to be burned than be found in the hands of a woman, or, Josephus kind of poo-pooing women as eyewitness testimony, that you would probably plausibly expect that it would be an embarrassing detail. But I just wouldn't put like a ton of weight on it to like make your whole case. Again, you could use it as part, but I like to use other things like, how are these stories grounded in actual history? What are the external confirmations that we have for some of the more granular details? Or what about undesigned coincidences and different things like that? How do these different stories dovetail within one another, where they're not just like, they're one person is saying one part of the story that kind of raises a question, that another person comes along and fills in that detail, but they're not doing it deliberately. Like, for example, the story with Herod saying, "Hey, what's the deal with Jesus?" Like, he's saying this to his servants in Matthew chapter 14. Like, why does he have these miraculous powers with him? Like, how did Matthew know what Herod is saying to his servants? Well, if you turn around in an unrelated passage in Luke chapter 8 and verse 3, we find out that, without Luke trying to explain this story, just happens to mention in passing that Joanna was one of Jesus's female followers who was married to Huzzah, who was Herod's household manager. So he has somebody working in there. And so, like, those are the kind of marks to me that are like, this screams eyewitness testimony. And embarrassment is just like one of those things. I wouldn't use it as a criterion, though, to go, okay, we can prove this story, but we can't prove this story because it doesn't really apply. And I'm going to use all these different criterion pericope by pericope. I'm just going to go, okay, these guys, again, constantly are telling me the truth or showing signs of verisimilitude over and over and over and over and over again. I have good reasons to trust them, even when, they're telling me things that I can't verify, that at least what they're telling me is what the eyewitnesses are reporting. Does that
And
make
it is
sense?
interesting, absolutely. And it is interesting that where you do have a contrast, say, with 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul's mention of the creed and then the appearances. You spoke before the list of 6 to Peter and James and the 12 and then 500 believers and all the apostles, then to Paul. He mentions male
Yeah.
men in that list. And so here he is in the Greco-Roman world trying to put forward reasons for belief in the resurrection of Jesus and to restate the summary with evidential force. And he doesn't mention women. And yet the Gospels, if you take Mark's dating earlier, roughly contemporary or a little bit after, and then the others come in the aftermath of that as well. You're effectively inserting in details then that would be less credible for the ancient audience, which just seems to be certainly a strange thing for the gospel writers to be doing if they are doing creative storytelling rather than historical reportage. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say, just contrast that to like apocryphal gospels where like you have Jesus being some giant with a talking cross behind him, like in the first, like Peter's gospel or different things like that.
The Gospel of Peter,
yeah. Like you don't see those kind of details really so much in the later apocryphal gospels, and so it's just like just do a comparison and see.
Yeah, super helpful. Well, to do that comparison as well a little bit between then Paul and the Gospels, one of the other criticisms that comes, and this is often from Muslims, is that there seems to be this giant wedge between the teachings of Paul and then the Jerusalem apostles, and that it's the teachings of Paul that contradict what we find as the teaching of Jesus in the Gospel. So let's check out this objection, and then I'd love to get your response.
Sure.
Jerusalem, and the leaders of Jerusalem, Peter, John, James, all men who walked with Jesus, all men who witnessed the miracles of Jesus, all men who heard the parables of Jesus, all men who heard the explanations to the parables of Jesus, all men who was there on the day of Pentecost when they received the Holy Spirit, who were leaders of the church, say Paul is wrong. It is true.
It's so true because there was never a split in the church.
It is true.
Split. That one half is
There's no split. I'll explain to you why there's no split. First thing, Paul didn't turn around and say, I seen Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he's saying something a little bit different to you guys. I'm the new way now. Forget what Jesus taught you. He didn't do that. What did he do? He acted like, yeah, Gov, I'm not saying that. But I'll take the Nazarite vow. I'm still under the law. And straight after that, he was imprisoned and killed. James was head of the church. James said to Paul, what you're saying, if you're saying it is wrong, go sort yourself out, mate. And show these people you're not saying it. And Paul's like, yes, boss.
All right, so there's a desire to draw a wedge between Jesus and Paul particularly, but given that the Gospels apparently are written either contemporary or after Paul's teaching, what do you make of the relationship between the two of them?
That whole video, I'm confused, honestly, because I understand the wedge that he's trying to draw there, but like, there's not a wedge there. Like, Paul literally takes a Nazarite vow in the 18th chapter of Acts, way before James ever told him to. It's Acts 18:18. He's in Cenchreae, and he does the same thing. He cuts his hair, and it's like, what are we talking about, Hamza? Like, I'm a little lost. Like, I wish I could ask him to clarify his point, because like there's no inconsistency. Paul on his own does that way before Acts chapter 21. And so, but I understand like that's the general Muslim objection, and a lot of other people try to do it too. They try to create this wedge between Paul and say like, well, Paul's preaching this whole like kind of more, the law's basically been done away with. You're completely justified by faith and all this other stuff. But I mean, if you actually just even read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's like, hey, if somebody's circumcised, he's like, don't try to remove it. Like, stay in your Jewishness. Don't get rid of your Jewishness. He's addressing Jewish believers. And like, I know this is kind of gross, but like during the whole Maccabean period, like some Jews were literally trying to like uncircumcise themselves in order to avoid some kind of persecution and different things like that. And Paul's saying like, no, do not do that. Rejoice in your Jewishness, remain in your Jewishness. There's nothing inconsistent with that. And what we would see in like Acts chapter 15, where Paul is present with the Jerusalem apostles, and they commission him and sent him to preach the gospel to the Gentiles and just say, hey, they don't have to be circumcised if they're Gentiles, and they just need to like avoid fornication and don't drink food, meat that's hasn't had the blood drained and everything else. There's nothing inconsistent with what we see in Acts chapter 15 with what we see in Paul's letters. And as I alluded to earlier, if Acts is written by a traveling companion of Paul, then his conversion experience reflects the unembellished testimony of somebody who was with him. It's Paul who's probably likely extracting his information out from him, right? And so this whole experience that Hamza is talking about is not just like something that was made up. Like, Paul did do these things. He did submit himself to the Jerusalem church, but we already know that from Galatians that he went, after 14 years of preaching the gospel, went back to the Jerusalem elders and presented his gospel to James and Peter and John, and said, like, hey guys, I just confirming once again, I'm preaching the same gospel that you guys are, right? And so there's no incongruency, there's no inconsistency whatsoever. And if anything, the book of Acts and Paul's letters completely demolished the whole standard Islamic narrative that Paul is just this like rogue prophet who's trying to reinvent Christianity into like whatever he wants it to. No, Paul is, again, he's taking a Nazirite vow twice, once because James, and he's completely reading that out of context too, by the way. I went back and reread that. They were upset because Paul was located with like some Gentiles near the temple. And they heard some things that were not true, that Paul was saying, like, you don't have to follow the Jewish law or anything else like that. And Paul's not saying that. He's still, I think he was a Torah observant Jew because of what we do read in Acts. I just think he's not compelling the Gentiles to live as a Torah observant Jew in order to be Christians. And so, but he takes this vow in the 18th chapter. And then we see it in the 21st chapter. They're only upset because they've heard some rumors and there's a Gentile with him and they freak out. And he's like, okay, well, if this is going to like calm people down, that's fine. But we already know Paul said, I become all things to all men so that I might win some. And if this is what you want me to do, then sure. And he said, we already know that he submitted himself to James. And so I don't really get Hamza's point here really at all.
I think there's certainly that worry that there's some strange undercurrent of tensions there in the New Testament between the book of James particularly, which still seems to have a very follow the wisdom of God flow to it and show me faith without deeds, and I'll show you my faith by what I do, and then these sorts of passages where is a conflict between Paul and Peter in Galatians, is a conflict between Paul and James there in Acts 21, and you need to play this up. But I think one thing I found really helpful processing that is none of the next generation of church leaders had any red flags when it came to Paul's teaching. And so irrespective of what you do with the authorship of a Second Peter, where, Paul writes many things in his letters which are difficult to understand, which wicked men distort to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures, sort of that famous verse. But even then you've not got any of them, whether it's from Rome, whether it's from Smyrna and Ephesus in John's territory, none of them are raising red flags and saying, you know what, the rest of the Jerusalem apostles, they're not really comfortable with the message that Paul writes in Acts and in his letters. They're fully endorsing him as an apostle and his gospel as the gospel. So yeah, it's just helpful to think about that, because otherwise it throws the gospels into question, where people say, well, the gospels either tell us the truth about Jesus, which is at odds with Paul's Christianity, or they're influenced by Paul's Christianity, but that we have the testimony of the Jewish leaders after their deaths as well going on in the next generation of church leaders. Just think there's not much of a leg to stand on that one. Mate, I just want to say a big you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, just throwing this back at Hamza, who do you think has more reliable information about Jesus? Paul, who knew the apostles, or Muhammad, who's living 600 years later and gets his revelation allegedly from an angel in a cave? Like seriously? Anyways, it doesn't. It's an odd objection for them to make to me, but anyway, go ahead.
Certainly on reliable historical grounds. And I just want to say thank you for helping us sort of navigate some of this territory, because I think as people are looking at it and saying, why do we trust these 4 books particularly? And we could add to that all of the other Gnostic Gospels that are making the rounds on social media. Here's a secret source of information that tells you the truth about what Jesus really said to Mary, or his secret relationships. but you just review the historical case for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John compared to these Gnostic Gospels, and they're worlds apart. And I just want to say thanks for helping people wrestle with many of the objections that they might have heard people bring up before, or maybe are wrestling with themselves as they're reading the Gospels. I'll make sure in the show notes we pull over some of the links from the videos that you've done in this area, which I've found really helpful over the years. Just wanted to say thank you for that. But certainly we've got a lot of mutual friends in different fields of scholarship and different YouTube channels that are addressing these questions as well. So if you do have particular doubts, you see something that's an objection that's raised, or you're reading in the scripture and you don't know how to navigate a particular question that you've got, please just do some great research. Check out Testify and the channel that Erik's running over there, or go and see Lydia McGrew's work on the New Testament and the Gospels, or Tim's work on particularly historical miracles and philosophical claims and methodology. There's just a lot of useful material there. Mate, do you have a sort of a parting message maybe to someone who's exploring the Gospels and wondering about the significance of Jesus, but is still sort of I don't know if I can take this credibly yet. Why would I trust some ancient books in what they have to say about this guy Jesus?
Sure. I mean, there's a couple things. One is that's how I felt when I began to read the Gospels as like a young. I was kind of like agnostic for a period of time in my teens, atheist, and I went back and read the Gospels, and I thought the character of Jesus was like a really compelling figure. But I did stumble on with the whole idea of miracles and different things like that. But I mean, if it's possible that God exists and he wants to present some kind of a message to humanity, then what other way is he going to authenticate an important messenger, a prophet, or a Messiah, or even somebody like his son, but by miracles? And so as I just continue to read the Gospels, and they just have the texture of history. And so I would just say, read the Gospels. And there's, of course, lots of good books and helpful things that I can, resources that I can like point people to. Any description, or every video that I have is a description of books that I recommend to people. But if you're really still struggling with doubts, even if you're a Christian, and you've just heard a lot of these objections and you don't still like totally know how to handle them, there is a service, and I hope you don't mind me plugging this, but I work with
Not at all.
Jonathan McClatchy and some other Christian apologists. There's a website you can check out called talkaboutdoubts.com, where we have a bunch of subject matter experts who can counsel with you one-on-one and talk to you about doubts. And we can set up like a Zoom call. It's 1-on-1, 2-on-1. I've been on many of them. And we can talk about, the robust case for the reliability of the Gospels and any objections, any questions that you might have. And so definitely, if you're, just kind of a seeker who's not sure, or if you've been a Christian for years, but you're just kind of got some niggling doubts that are bothering you, avail yourself to that. Don't just kind of suffer through it alone. We would be more than happy to help you. And it's been highly encouraging me to be involved in those calls and those conversations, because you see the lights kind of come on with people, and where there was anxiety and kind of like consternation, it just kind of can disappear. And people are like, wow, like there really is an overwhelming case for this stuff. And so definitely, I highly, highly recommend it. Again, it's talkaboutdoubts.com. And it doesn't have to necessarily be about gospel reliability. We have philosophers like Doug Groothuis. Tim McGrew is one of the counselors. They could talk to you about the existence of God. Stephen Meyer, different things like that. Max Baker Heitch is really phenomenal with the problem of evil. He's one of the counselors.
Yeah, we've had him on the channel a bunch. I've done debates with him in the past. Fun guy.
Yeah, he's an awesome guy. And so, if any question you have, we probably have somebody that's an expert that can talk to you.
Yeah, definitely thoroughly recommend that as well. So talkaboutdoubts.com, you can go and just register to have a call with someone. Well, thanks so much, Erik, for coming on. Really appreciate you doing that. And if you are not yet a subscriber to Erik's channel over at Testify, you do need to check that out. Look at the show notes, click it, go over now. Make sure you subscribe, because he puts out these phenomenal little 1-minute clips helping to wrestle with big objections or doubts or questions that people put up, and longer videos that are technical. They're really dealing with the nitty-gritty of historiography and argumentation, and what can we know about the reliability of the Gospels and the New Testament, as well as a number of other objections and questions that people have. So go and check that out. If you're not subscribed to Questioning Christianity yet, please do that. Click and hit the bell and all the rest of it. And over on our social media channels, Facebook and Instagram, we often take our 5 to 10 minute videos and try and break them down into infographics to really help you wrestle with the content, get the key ideas and quotes and data to be able to make that shareable for you. If you want to subscribe and support what we do, you can go to questioningchristianity.com or just check down below for the Patreon details. Just want to say a huge thank you for helping us connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. Until next time, we'll see you later. Thanks for joining, mate.